Hey everyone, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Jenda, and this is the history of the world. Last time we saw the evolution of humanity and the emergence over 10,000 years ago of the very first lasting human settlements. And now we begin our story in earnest. 6,000 years ago, years 4000 BCE, something like 6,000 years before what some have prophesied will be considered modern times. This is not yet actually recorded history for the simple reason there are still no organized writing systems to record it in. Just proto-writing based on symbols and ideograms, which unfortunately does mean that this episode is still based mainly on archaeological events, and all dating and events are highly uncertain at best. That said, we do know some solid facts, and I'll do my best to go over them. Just because history has not really begun does not mean civilization has not, which is why we're starting at this point. Permanent settlements are now emerging and growing in earnest in Mesopotamia, and they're starting to emerge in Egypt and China as well, although Egypt's maybe borrowing from Mesopotamia, but there's not enough evidence to be sure of that. Now, why Mesopotamia? Why is this happening in Mesopotamia, and what is it that's happening? Well, the space between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and particularly their delta as they approach the Persian Gulf, is flat and well watered. At the time, the Gulf came quite a bit more inland than it did today. It's since silted up rather heavily. But it's one of the most agriculturally viable areas in the world, a massive double river delta. This area, plus Egypt and the area to the west, near the Mediterranean at the least, is called the Fertile Crescent. It's very well suited for early farming. Now, it's already been 5,000 years or so since the gatherer peoples of the world started to deliberately plant barley and wheat for later harvest, but they only really began to settle down in the last 2,000 years, initially in small numbers. But by now, they've already done quite a bit of selective breeding in improving those crops. They've domesticated most of what we would think of as common farm animals. And already away in the past now, they reached a tipping point where it was first possible, and then, due to their growing population, necessary to sustain that population with deliberate farming in permanent communities. It's no longer possible for everyone in Mesopotamia to be sustained using just hunting and gathering. And from that point, this little thing we're calling civilization started to grow. It's still pretty primitive, but the people in this area are starting to build irrigation systems between and from the river branches to support their farms. They're cultivating barley and wheat on a very wide scale, along with pasturing sheep and other useful animals. Now, they, and nearly every other people in the world, practice extensive pottery making. That's one of the most commonly found artifacts that tells us anything about them. Now, this civilization is not fully developed. Systems of writing and mathematics are in their infancy at best. Obviously, they're not idiots, but any formal written mathematics is not really a thing yet. There's no currency around just yet. Society is using a barter system. But something tells me the scent of change is in the air. Things are starting to move in a way they've never moved in history. Now, one bit of technology that does exist, metalworking. This isn't the Stone Age anymore. We don't have a very good metal. The metal of choice is copper. It's a bit soft and fragile. There are definitely tougher metals that we know about in the world, like iron, but nobody's figured out a way to melt iron yet. It takes quite a lot of heat, although it is much more common than copper, but copper is fairly abundant, and although it's very soft and ductile for a metal, that's actually an asset. Turns out you can cold hammer copper into shape, and if you heat it over even an ordinary campfire, it will be malleable enough to turn it into something more complicated, like a bracelet. So it's not the most spectacular metal if you look at some of the things that are in the ground that we can't really get, but it's definitely a lot less brittle and easier to work with than stone, so it's a pretty valuable advance to the world. Really, this is the only metal we've got, and so we can't complain too much about it. Now, at this point, there's basically 3 hubs of civilization in the world. The rest of the world is mainly what we would call pottery cultures scattered about. We don't know very much about them, except for the pottery that we find after they collapse. The big development of this moment is not one that a lot of people will notice, but I've been keeping a close eye on things, and I think it might just come to be something. A couple of villages on the lower Euphrates, one of them dedicated to the goddess Inanna, and the other to the goddess Anna, have merged and created the village of Uruk. It's a pretty big village already, maybe 1,000 people or something, but seems like it might be primed to grow. Egypt, meanwhile, is what we would call the early Naqada culture. They have painted, black-topped pottery. They have basic permanent settlements similar to Mesopotamia, mostly on the upper Nile. The Nile Delta is actually not the original. The Nile Delta is not uninhabited, but it's not the early center of civilization here. No doubt people will spread up and down the Nile fairly quickly, though. China is also well inhabited already at this stage by what we would call the Yangshao culture. These people are not quite as settled and civilized as those in the West yet. They're semi-nomadic. They do build semi-permanent villages and farm intensively, but they haven't worked out a way of doing it that doesn't exhaust the land yet. As they exhaust the land, after a few years, they move their villages wholesale. But they do have a pretty extensive agricultural system along the Yellow River with millet, some rice, pigs, dogs, and they produce this fine red, white, and black pottery. They weave hemp. They have a bit of silk. Small amounts, but some silk. Over in Europe, the place is mostly filled with the funnel beakers, which are just one example of the pottery cultures that are all over the world. They live on a combination of hunting and gathering and animal husbandry, some planting of crops, but not really settled agriculture, the way we're seeing around some river systems. The funnel beaker culture in particular earns its name because of these funnel-shaped pottery, this funnel-shaped pottery style that they use, but it's not otherwise anything special. This is what most of the world looks like at the moment, but not so interesting compared to this civilization lark. Now, a couple of other notes here, 4,000. There are some natural variations in the Earth's orbit taking place, along with the luminance of the sun, and it appears that the grassy green Sahara we all know and love is having a bit of a struggle. Rainfall levels have dropped off pretty steeply, and the mighty Lake Mega-Chad has begun to shrink to such an extent that we may soon have to just call it Lake Chad, which would be a terrible blow to all society. On the bright side, some enterprising farmers have come up with the genius idea of taking a bunch of their basic hoes and digging sticks, handheld of course, that they use for farming, tying them together, and attaching them to the back of an ox. And then they're calling this the plow. Now, for farmers who are successful and wealthy enough to own a draft animal or two, this seems like it will really speed up the process of preparing fields for planting, and it might allow them to plant drastically larger areas, although there's still the harvest bottleneck. But no, this image is Egyptian from a bit further around the line. We don't actually know exactly where the plow was first invented. It's not that complicated. Probably many farmers independently invented it. Anyway, over in Karnak, some of the local hunter-gatherers are starting to put up rows of granite stones. This is possibly some kind of graveyard or monument. I'm not sure myself, but whatever it is apparently important enough to them to go to quite a great deal of effort. Many of these stones are as much as 13 feet or 4 meters high, And they have only stone and some copper hand tools to carve them out with, so they're certainly going to some big effort here. Right, it's now 3800 BCE. The emergence of civilization is not coming without its quarrels, unfortunately. You would sort of expect this. It's very disruptive, of course. Everyone has been a hunter-gatherer for as long as anyone can remember. Until now. And about now, we've found some mass graves at Tel Brak, a city in Syria, which unfortunately does mean that warfare is taking a pretty significant leap up from tribal to city levels right along with civilization. Now, unfortunately, further details other than the existence of the graves are scarce. Another 100 years, 3700 BCE. There's been a pretty major breakthrough in the organization of society. The growing city of Uruk taken a big step towards recording and formalizing the bartering process. Specifically, they've started to create these clay tokens at the bottom, which record transactions using proto-writing symbols. And they put these into hollow clay balls called bullae for tamper-proofing. And then they store these tokens in a central archive or treasury so that a neutral party holds the record. Now, this can greatly reduce disputes about agreements, considering they're the first sort of non-verbal contract. Obviously, they can only express relatively basic agreements, but we're talking, you know, paid X for X type things using just symbols, but it's still something. It's a step towards maybe a future where people don't have to just exchange physical goods for everything, or perhaps where some sort of, well, I can hardly conceive of it at the moment, but perhaps some sort of system where non-tangible goods, or where some sort of tokens like this could be used for the transactions directly instead of just recording them, if you see what I'm saying. Now, another 100 years, 3600 BCE. Maize. Another big step for the other branch of humanity. Humanity, of course, as you all know, split in half since the end of the Ice Age a few thousand years ago. No possibility at the moment, it seems, of them being reunited, except perhaps if another Ice Age happened. Could happen at any time, no way to predict. Anyway, the Mesoamericans have begun to domesticate one of their local crops, one of their local plants, maize. They're growing it around the Balsas River in Central America. It has kernels rather than how you would like. It's a bit different than wheat, but still a pretty good grain product. And in related news, they've discovered that these seed kernels, they can be edible just on their own, but if you heat them over a campfire, they'll actually pop open, which has proved a particularly delicious innovation in food, especially when paired with salt. Now, in Egypt, the local civilization is making the interesting choice to intentionally wrap their dead in linens. They're treating the corpses with oils made of conifer resin and some other plant extracts. Not a perfect process. The organs inside the body tend to rot pretty soon, among other issues. I'm not sure exactly why they're doing this. It seems to have something to do with their rituals for the dead, obviously. But it might be a bit of a self-sustaining thing. It seems like as they do it, everyone's expected to do it. The dead need it to be preserved in the next life. Impossible to say for sure. We don't have a lot of anything to go on out of Egypt, but at least we're getting some information. Also, agriculture in Europe is beginning to really take, not to the level of the three big centers of civilization around the rivers, but there is some evidence for some settled agriculture on an increasing scale in southern Europe in particular, where the Baden culture is. They've also changed pottery styles, which is probably means there's been some kind of migration or other drastic change up there. Hard to say what. Information very scarce from these uncivilized areas, but you know how it is. The locals on Malta have been building an impressively large temple complex dedicated to a local fertility goddess. I'm not sure if this is the only one around, but spoilers, this one in particular is actually going to last about 5,500 years and will still be standing as of then, which is quite remarkable, with its original floor plan preserved and everything. In any case, back to 3,500. Well, forwards a little to 3,500. After some millennia, 3,500 BCE that is, of course. After several millennia of hunting them for meat, the peoples on the vast Eurasian steppes have finally managed to figure out how to catch the free-ranging horses there and care for them enough to properly domesticate them. Now, these turn out to be excellent draft animals, as I understand it. They're not as good as oxen, of course, but it seems their combination of strength, speed, and temper has made them well suited to be ridden by humans, which is quite rare. And that is pretty much unique and extremely powerful for those steppe people. I'm sure they won't abuse this in the future. Meanwhile, unfortunately, our worst nightmares have come to pass in Central Africa. Lake Megachad has continued to shrink rapidly for the past 500 years, and seems set to lose the overwhelming majority of its surface area. We will, sadly, have to just call it Lake Chad from now on. Still cool, but no longer a god among lakes. The Sahara around it, meanwhile, has lost most of its grasses, and the resulting dust storms have really accelerated the desertification process, so unfortunately the vast Sahara plains have now become the Sahara Desert and are quite inhospitable to human life, although this has driven more people into Egypt and seems to have helped that civilization grow a bit. Now, there's a stir going on over in Mesopotamia as well. They've invented this thing called a wheel, which is basically just a wooden circle and then a rod in the middle of the wooden circle that they put into a cart. Now, nobody's ever heard of a cart before either, but they've made this thing called a cart. It's not actually that complicated an idea once you see it. It just requires a bit of woodworking skill, but now that they've got it, it's spread across Europe with lightning speed. Turns out, using one of these, anyone with a reasonably sized farm animal or two, a donkey, an ox, they can hugely increase their effective carrying capacity just using a couple of wheels to make one of these cart things. So that will really help out with trade. Also, in a rather impressive sign of humanity's increasing mastery of the environment, a particularly crazy ruler in Hierakonpolis, Egypt, which is one of the leading centers of the civilization there, has created the world's first example of what he's calling a menagerie or a zoo. He's been putting live crocodiles, elephants, hippopotami, leopards, and other animals on display, apparently just for his own amusement and that of his people. Which, yeah, these humans really are getting a little above the rest of the environment at this point, aren't they? Another 100 years, 3,400 BCE. The Mesopotamian nation is becoming centered more and more around that little village of Uruk that unified 600 years ago. Actually, over the past several hundred years, it's developed into by far the largest city in the world. It has a population now of as many as 40,000 people, which is absolutely astounding, probably several times any other city I've ever heard of. It's actually the only city at the moment that it's developed a bunch of unique classes of people that have never been heard of before, some insane levels of stratification that didn't really exist before. They have dedicated ruling class, not just tribal chiefs, but probably actual noble rulers who were like special by dint of their birth. We don't fully understand this, but seems to be a thing that's happening there. They also have priests dedicated just to religion, which, everybody's got their holy man, but they have a lot of them over there, and a lot of competing religion, not competing religions, but competing gods. And they also have merchants who do nothing but trade stuff with people. This is also, quite something. And many other professions as well. They have an unprecedented amount of specialization over there, and it seems to really be helping out their civilization as a whole. Turns out allowing people to specialize like this is actually a considerable net benefit. Now, note, although this image is kind of accurate, they don't have the wall yet, so... And whether that white temple is actually finished yet is uncertain, but they're getting there. Now, not only has Uruk itself grown to be a city of 40,000, it's sort of spread its model out around it. There are a lot of smaller settlements, both in the Tigris and Euphrates delta around it, and the whole Fertile Crescent into the Persian steppes and up towards Anatolia, that seem to be based on the Uruk model. I haven't been able to confirm whether these were colonies of Uruk exactly, or if they just took some of its ideas. But anyway, this is starting to spread pretty widely. A lot of these smaller towns, shadows of Uruk's grandeur, but definitely growing, are coming to exist, and they have probably influenced the development of the civilization along the Nile River as well. Plus, there are other developments in the region. The potter's wheel, which really improves the quality and speed of manufacturing pottery. The actual wheel. But more importantly, they're on the brink of another critical development. In Uruk, those proto-writing systems they've been using for millennia have reached a sort of critical mass. They have hundreds of signs in use now. They're carving them onto clay tablets for accounting and record keeping. Not just clay balls with tokens, but just they're actually carving clay tablets to keep track of deals and inventories and so on. So we're on the brink of entering what we might call recorded history, perhaps, in the future. A point when things are actually written down for the future. Something to think about. Civilization's growing fast. Over the last 700 years, we've had some transformative advances in the technology. The plow, the wheel, written records. We've had the development of... Apparently, this agriculture business is here to stay in several places around the world. Society's becoming more and more complex at quite a rate. There are hierarchies and roles, much more elaborate than we had in the old hunter-gatherer tribes. Is this writing? This writing seems primed to maybe take things up another notch altogether as well. Or it might be a flash in the pan. Kind of seems like this civilization's here to stay, though. So, well, join me next time in 3300 BCE to find out. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a nice century while you wait.